All right, everyone, welcome to this workshop. We're going to get started here in a couple minutes. So this is a silvopasture and eastern hardwood forest workshop. My name is Marissa Arnoldson. I'm the soil health specialist at Oak as part of our Climate Smart project. And today we have Brann, who is a former NRCS specialist and currently works at his Big Spring Farm, and Chedzoy, who's a forester from Cornell Extension. Both of them here to talk to you guys about silvopasture. So just a couple housekeeping things before. We got exits in the back. If you need CEU credits, you can sign up for those at the registration desk. We have handouts that I think I still need to pass out, so I'll get those to all you guys as we get going here. And then also we'll be handing out little yellow response sheets. So if at the end of the workshop you can fill those out for us, that would be great. We'll take a break after the first speaker, about an hour in, and there'll be plenty of room for questions between, so feel free to hop in and ask questions when you have them. There'll also be time at the end, and at the very end, a larger, kind of extended conversation and just shared learning period. So thank you for being here, and we'll get started with Brann.
All right. Yeah, so this is an area where I have subtracted some trees, and it's not desirable vegetation there. This is in the conversion of a forest, a mediocre forest, to silvopasture, and I wouldn't recommend. I've been on farms where they had a beautiful white oak stand, 30, 40-inch white oak, and he talking about silvopasture, and I said, I cannot go with this because it's too nice of trees. So it's more, in my mind, for mediocre to low-value trees. And what we're doing, we're kind of like timber stand improvement. I'm already on top of Brett's stuff, but we're growing grass instead of regeneration as with timber stand improvement. So this is some undesirables. We've got some Japanese stilt grass, we got wing stem, and I would say that there's some parliament there somewhere. Anyway, I used hogs in this, and you'll see some pictures of them, to convert it over and reduce the biomass. It's a lot about managing light. So here's an overview. What I hope to cover, plan to cover, is what is the silvopasture and why do it. And mainly I'm going to focus on the pasture to trees, but we're also Brett will talk more about trees to pasture. And managing light is a huge thing, that energy source. And then managing disturbance. And I will also work with the Soil Health Division of NRCS, and part of one of the principles of soil health is minimize disturbance. In a grazing situation, we want to optimize disturbance. Disturbance can be a good thing. Grazing is a disturbance. Tillage is a disturbance. Fire is a disturbance. And it can stimulate things if we do it correctly. All right. So I'm just going to read this because this is a standard definition. Silvopasture is an agroforestry practice that integrates trees, livestock, and forage management on the same piece of land to diversify production, increase animal well-being, and enhance ecosystem services. This is a picture up here. I guess that's a pointer. It's a flasher. Let me go backwards. Yeah, that's some sumac, and sumac are real high in antioxidants, and they have we'll see some numbers a little later, but I think they have a low ADF, so very digestible. The animals didn't like it as well as I thought they would, but I've got a lot of sumac I leave in the pastures where I've converted it from CRP. All right. So why practice silvopasture? It improves productivity of land typically managed.
That top button's a pointer if you want to.
Okay, I tried it. Let's see, let you do it. It's a flasher. It's okay. Yeah. Yeah, so it can increase productivity by 42 to 55%. However, the individual land use, yeah, that's still the right one. Okay, sorry. The individual land use or use, like grass, might decrease. Timber production may decrease, but the over-yielding of the whole system increases by 42 to 55%. So why wouldn't you do it? It's the same as increasing your land base by that much. All right. So this is a walnut silvopasture. Those trees are 12 years old. That's on my place, and that's my animals. Again, now we've only been grazing this for, I think it's a year and a half now. And so the forage isn't wonderful there. But in those trees, they're somewhere from 40 to 80 feet apart in general. But here's all the management skills that you might need depending on how far you want to go with it. The forage crop alone, that's like a crop, just like raising corn. You've got to manage the forage. Then the livestock interaction, herbivores and the crop, that's complicated enough. But then we may even want to add sheep and goats and cattle and pigs and others, to the mix. And again, we've added some more complexity. So silvopasture is some high-level management to pull it off. And then trees for timber. One thing I don't have listed here is pollinators. And then the pruning, we need to know how to prune that. The deciduous trees are different than the conifers. So, and then the fodder side and the whole ecology. It's just, there's a lot going on. So it's really cool and fun and amazing what we can pull off. And here's looking at all the different interactions going on. I'm not going to talk about every one of these numbers, but there is a lot going on. You can see in the picture here, there's some stumps where they've removed trees to get more light. That would be, and your decision of culling will be based on what your goal is. I'll try to stay off of that, but light is important for us to grow good grass. They've got some tree protection on some young trees there. And of course you have your ecosystem services. So we can extend the forage growing season. It just kind of flattens out, which is a good thing. It's just like a high tunnel, and we can extend it further into the summer and then get more growth early on. Then the shade also reduces the heat stress on the animals as well as the forage. And the shelter side of it, we'll talk a little about living barns. And then we've got the whole thing of nuts. Some people harvest walnuts or whatever for another production side. And then the fruit and all, the leaf fodder we mentioned earlier. There's a practice of coppicing and pollarding. Will you touch on that, Brett, later? Yeah. And then the ecosystem services, that's a huge one. Typically, the infiltration will be a little lower on pasture than it is on woods. However, when you add the silvopasture, it increases infiltration for the pasture. So there's a lot of interaction going on. We've got a few NRCS people here. Y'all want to raise your hands? I hate to call you out here. Yeah. So you may want to visit with them later. And am I right that in general with silvopasture, there's cost share sometimes available? Every state and county is different, but it's normally from pasture to trees, not trees to pasture. Am I correct? Yeah. So you could visit with them on that side of things. And then I've already talked about the infiltration. And then the fuel load, managing fire management, we can reduce that with grazing. So here's the pigs on the left, just reducing some of the biomass. And those of you that have pigs realize that if we had and you can keep pigs in, once they're trained to electric wire, you can keep them in super easy with a single wire. The standard recommendation is have the hot wire, electric wire, nose height of the animal you're trying to control. A little pig like this is hard to control, but as they get bigger. But anyway, if y'all were pigs, and I had my wire right here, about 4 foot back from this fence is where they're going to root. And they're going to tear that up. So if I wanted to till a field, I would just keep moving that 4 feet a day, or whatever period, and get it tilled up. And we don't, looking at conservation and runoff and all that, we want as little exposure as possible, so you need to reseed after that tillage event. And it's good to time it where it's near a growing season when you would normally plant a grass. And we'll see some that I have planted. And that was just sheep and goats going down or sheep and cattle going down the road there. So grazing the woodland is not silvopasture. Although if you wanted to get, say, some poplar to germinate and it had enough light, a little disturbance could do that. But this is not silvopasture. So thin for quality, again, that's like thinning for a timber stand improvement. And with grass, we would thin to get more grass growth in there. And then thin for light, that again, everything's going to need some light to grow. And this is an animation. This is probably loblolly pine. This is from down south. And so that's beginning to get a little more shade there than what we need to grow the grass. And well, I'll get into some of this later. Some people term that dapple shade. It's just kind of scattered shade. So there's half the trees removed. I'll go back. And so there's the tree removal. Going to grow more grass in this case and bigger trees. Now, this is talking about grazing management. I don't really like this picture because it's grazed mighty short. That's, in my mind, that's not great grazing management. However, this is in Bahia country, and they can graze it lower. But it's showing some cross fencing there, and in general, in silvopasture, you're going to need to rotate. I'm always going to push you toward two times a week or more often. However, if it's a once a week rotation, and it depends on stocking rate, but it's going to take some grazing management. Otherwise, you're going to damage some trees, and compaction is the biggest killer of trees other than those little seedlings where they graze the top out of. All right, so some people say, well, they don't need shade. They just need to be out there grazing. Well, they've found that they graze more if they have shade. And the uniformity of grazing is better where they have uniform shade. And manure distribution is better. So there's a lot of benefits from that. And then water consumption goes up as much as 40% in the summer over if they don't have the shade. So this is a heat humidity index, and basically the way I remember it is 80% humidity on the x-axis in temperature, 80 degrees on the temperature gets you in that alert zone. So any combination that gets you in that alert zone is where they need shade. And there's been studies done, most of them in Missouri, but they showed that 3/4 more pound a day than cattle without shade. And then artificial shade, average daily gain was 20% more than those without shade. But with natural shade, it was 60% more. So it's some huge differences there. And I developed this number, this minimum shade number here at 630 square feet, and I just based it on, that's twice the amount of area that an animal would need to do a 360. You adjust that however you want to, but that's how I calculate it. And that doesn't work out to a whole lot of area, like if you're fencing some woods out to leave them some shade, it's not a big area for most farms. So this came out of the agroforestry, working trees, agroforestry tech note, and it's looking at different combinations, different ways of planting trees. Either, and this is kind of just what people have gone with, is either a single row, a double row, or 3. And I drew those orange lines there because we got to protect those trees till they're about 15 feet tall. Would you agree, Brett? And that's going to be, people talk in years, but it's going to be at least 5 years. And it depends on if that animal has horns. If it's a Highlander or has horns, it can get that tree under its horn and walk it down and eat the foliage. I'm sure, goats, they really work together. One pulls the limb down, the others come eat it, and they can work it out. So we need some tree protection. And in general, I'm looking at it, like I say, I step it from grass to how much shade they need and where they need it. And then, and we'll look at this a little more in depth. But I like the one tree per fence, right? So I've got a solid fence going down through here. I'll plant a tree about 2.5 feet off of that fence, and then there'll be another fence right over there, and it can be a single wire. All I'm doing is controlling the cattle from getting to it. The sheep are the least damaging livestock on trees. Goats are pretty bad, in that they can go bipedal and stand up and get things. And if I'm using a tree tube, I'll typically use a 5 or 6 foot tree tube. So again, they can't get to it very well. And if that fence is here, then they're having to reach over. So it's just out of their range. It's worked real well. I've got some chest. Test. I don't think they sell those anymore. Yeah. I've got some pictures of them. And I've run a hot wire right at the top of that tree tube, but I've never wrapped it in electric or anything. To me, I'm always going to plant down a fence row. I'm not going to probably be out in the middle of the field planting unless it's fruit trees. Then I do a cage that's about 5 foot diameter around it. But that's a lot more work. So this is more of a group planting, still got shade for availability for every paddock. So it's more of a block planting, and you decide what's best based on your landscape and what your desires are. There's the hawk. I think it's a sparrowhawk. And so he's just leaving this area here, and that's when they were younger. So forages for silvopasture, we're going to move into that now. And there's where I was talking about evening out the growth curve. Normally, it varies year to year based on our weather conditions, but you're going to have a little less production in June or May, but it's going to even out and spread out the growth, be more into August, July, August, and then a little more into late fall. So again, managing light is a huge thing. And cool season grasses need a minimum of 50% light hitting the ground. Warm season grasses need more light hitting the ground, like 60%. And if we have less than 35% light, most likely you're just going to grow weeds. You're going to still have something growing there, but it's going to be undesirable, like that first picture I showed. Okay, and this is looking at canopy gap. And so the minimum is a 1/10 acre, which is, I had it somewhere, I believe it's 60 by 60, and then 1 acre being there's not much increase in production when you get larger than 1 acre. I say that, but it also has to do with the narrowness of it. If it's real narrow and it's an acre, I think you need 60, 80 feet, really minimal, even though a lot of the literature talks about 40 feet. I haven't seen good grass growth in 40 feet. And there's the pigs. They were kind of nervous that day, but yeah, so they can be destructive. If they're in there too long, then they're going to cause some compaction and even girdle the trees, that kind of thing. And of course, they're wallas and all that. Now, this study was in Missouri, and it was, there's not a lot of studies on how forages grow with reduced light. This was actually done in pots, so some of it you got to take with a grain of salt, but you can see how they rated. Like reed canary grass rated real good with shade tolerance, and then orchard grass, thus the name orchard grass. It's a standard grass that we would use in silvopasture. Kentucky bluegrass does good. Another one that does good, but it's not good forage, is the vine fescues. Like creeping red fescue grows great in low light, but not a good forage. Annual ryegrass, I think, does a little better than this shows. I've had good experience with annual ryegrass in shade. Crown vetch, very expensive, but it does good in low light. Curra clover, I haven't used it, but a lot of people have a good experience with curra clover. And crimson has been used significantly. All right. Oh, one, well, I don't think it's in here, is annual Espadiza does great in shade. You wouldn't suspect it, but it does. Tick clovers, there's different tick clovers, but they rate really good. This is more natives. It and eastern gamagrass are the top two. Tick clover is the stick tights, the triangular stick tights that get on you. And they're great for quail, but they're, I call it, what clover? Yeah, tick clover, yeah. And Desmodium is a genus, I think. All right. Switchgrass, I've seen it do okay in silvopasture, but it didn't rate well here. So, yeah, digestibility and protein can go up in silvopasture, and it stands to reason because it's got less fiber. It's reaching for light. The production in our rainfall will decrease in silvopasture. So let's see, yeah, and yeah, here's one. 20 to 35% shade. If you're just interested in grass, you only want 20 to 35% shade. So a low number of trees is, figure how much shade the livestock need, and it can be as little as 4 to 7 trees per acre. Most people are thinking, they've heard the pine type plantings, so that are start with 300 trees. That's way too many hardwoods. Brett, where do you find your best growth of forage with trees? Yeah, you'll talk about. Exactly. Yeah.
Putting trees into pasture, we need to remember that we're going to start with more trees than we ultimately need to wind up with.
If you're going to manage them, a lot of people aren't going to manage them. So another thing in planting trees, and maybe I'm coming at it too much from the forage side, but is people will plant, like chestnuts. That's a one that's commonly planted in Tennessee area, and they plant them on a 40-foot spacing. So they're 40-foot rows and then 40 foot apart, and that's a lot of trees. And I've got the math in here a minute. We'll go through to see how many trees it is per acre. And that's good initially, and if you're selling chestnuts, that's a good place to be. But they're thinking that, well, so a lot of them are going to die, or I'm going to take out the worst ones. It's going to be hard to take them out if they're a desirable tree. Some years, yeah, we lose a lot of trees in a planting, but in general, I don't see a lot of tree loss. I think I'm getting off on something else. All right, so right here. So looking at that there's the 40 by 40. That's 27 trees per acre. Doesn't sound like that much, but that's going to be a lot of shade. And there's a Virginia Tech publication, and it talks about. I've got a picture of one page of it, but it's a real good publication on density of the crown and width of the crown, and it talks about trees for fodder. It's really good. John Fike he's done a lot of work with silvopasture, and he's out of Virginia Tech. So anyway, you see the numbers there. All you do is get your tree spacing and you divide it into 43, 5, 60, and it'll tell you how many trees are per acre. Well, let me back up. I didn't say anything about that planting. Yeah, I think that's just some more chestnuts, but it's a different technique. I left it like 6 feet, maybe 7 foot off of the fence, and then put a single wire out there. So you could mow both sides of those trees. I don't like that as well. I'm gonna go ahead and say this, since we're in an organic conference, is anytime you're using like woven wire, it's harder to maintain without chemicals. So think about that. Because vines are going to get all over it. So you either need to raise it up where you can mow underneath it. I love a zero turn for no chemical situation. Watch those zero turns on slopes. But yeah, and the farther the posts are apart, the easier it is to maintain. The high tensile woven wire is a wonderful product, and if thinking silvopasture wise, if it grows into a hedge, if you can maintain one side of the fence and the animals aren't on the other, then maybe so be it. Maybe it's not a big deal. But realize it's going to grow up if you can't, or you're going to do a lot of weed eating. And it's hard to weed eat it if it's on the ground. Yeah, for a zero turn to fit in there. I don't like it. I like that first one we saw where this tree is 2.5 feet off of the fence, and then just a single wire out here. Can't mow. You just mow the one side. And then you can mow under this wire, but you can't mow where the trees are unless you had a gap and took it down. It would take some pains, loosen the wire, that kind of thing. All right. This is another planting, and it's a 3-row one, and it can be mown, but I quit mowing it. Again, the sheep, we turn them in there some. There's a lot, in selecting trees, that goes to that Virginia Tech publication, is look at that and to come up with what your desires are, what your goal is. And of course, soil type's always important. And certain trees are more adapted to bottomland or wet soils than upland, and same for forages. The living barn, I know that Brett has a picture of a living barn, one better than I do, but I've got one of just some cedar trees. And Brett, you're still with Cornell, right? Yeah. And this was tree species for fodder. Black locust, willow, mulberry, poplar, they were all, so they're more for browse. Willow is, it's like aspirin dose, isn't it? I think it's aspergillus or whatever, so when they browse it. And I'm going to let him talk about the pollarding and coppicing. You want to touch on it now, or you want to wait? Okay. All right. And, we've got the hardiness zone. Look at how the trees are adapted, and forages are adapted to different zones. And then there's cultivars that are more winter hardy than others. And here's some tree protection here. I used to grow Christmas trees, and they would be fine until it snowed. And then the deer tore them up. They'd eat every leader out of those trees because they didn't see other forage. It was easy to get. So in this case, they're using a mesh so that the conifer can still get light and have its branches. Because in that tree tube in general, unless it already had branches, it's not going to develop branches. Let's see, and then there's just different methods of planting this. And then this little top like that, you can use the construction fabric or something like that to put over these trees to protect the leader, the top of the, I keep wanting to use a pointer, but the top branch on the trees is the most important. We don't want them to get that top or leader. Let's see. What else? I think we've covered all that. There's Greg Hallich and Gabrielle. That's Bert Tarkett. Anyway, this is on Caney River Farm, Caney Creek Farm, Al Gore's farm, and that's an arbor shield and then a tree tube. And they, mainly chestnuts out there, but they would raise the tree tube when the cows came in to keep them from getting that top. Big job. You don't want to get into that, I don't think. So that's a quick coupler. That's just an easy way to get water, the one with the yellow cap there. You can use above ground water, but in general, I'm going to recommend get it underground. If you go with above ground pipe, buy it get the compression fittings. And you have to buy the pipe and the compression fitting from the same company to make sure it's going to fit. Or buy your compression fittings and make sure it matches up with if you buy pipe local. You want a high PSI pipe so that it freezes but it doesn't burst. What else do we need to look at? We've talked about a number of these things. Yeah, I think we're okay. So this is Craig Harper, UT, Knoxville, looking at deer browse, but looking at quality. And you can see the quality is pretty good on some of these, like that Desmodium, the beggar lice, or tick clover, 21% crude protein. Now, the lower the ADF, the better the quality. So sumac had a real good ADF, not as so great on the protein. And I've got a few of these. This is that Virginia Tech publication, just looking at one page. And in this example, it's showing the root structure, the crown shape, crown width, density, and the smaller the lighter the density, the more light's going to come through. Like walnut would be a real low crown density, more open. Walnut and locust are two of the lightest, easiest ones to grow grass under. And it's got the mature height there too. This came from a Scottish silvopasture site, and as it's just showing aspen and willow, this is more for fodder. And you can see ash is pretty palatable. And then alder's not so palatable. And the inverse of this, what that means is the resilience of those that aren't so palatable is higher because they have more tannins in them a lot of times, and animals avoid them. So some people call it medicinal pasture, or anyway, it's good for them to get some of that browse. So steps to establishment of forage in a forest. Of course, we need to thin those trees down, and then we got to remove some of the debris. Help me with the name of that machine that just does such a wonderful job. It comes in and just shreds everything. They're expensive. What is it? Yeah. Forestry mulcher. Those are just amazing, but they're going to cost you to run those. So I went the cheap route, and that was just chainsawing pigs and slow time. No. I think it's Brett's, isn't it? It came out of Virginia Tech publication, so they already stole it. So I thought I'd be okay stealing it too. So. I stole it from you. But that's fence post, right? Black locust? Yeah. Yeah. So there's lots of ways to do it. Soil test wise, we always like to see a soil test to know where we are, what's the benchmark, and where we're headed. Whether you're going to apply nutrients or not, it just helps you to know how to manage to get those nutrients there. Feed hay out there, whatever it might be. Typically, my experience is the forest is going to be high organic matter, low in phosphorus and potash. And the pastures are going to be a little lower in organic matter, and a lot of times they're off in phosphorus and potash as well. Where you graze, it's easier to build potash than anything else because manure is high in potassium. All right. So that's a picture of the annual Aspidisa mentioned earlier. Yes, so you could just manage for natural regeneration, but you got to be patient if you're doing that. You know, just let whatever's out there come up. That's going to take time. And, you know, there would be seed come through the manure, through the hay. But again, most humans are not patient enough to make that happen. The four-wheeler's got a herd seeder on it, and you can get about anywhere with that. That's great for legumes. We're here almost in February. Now's the time to be thinking about those legumes if you're going to overseed, even pastures. But yeah, so I try to time that planting again around the time that I would be planting something like cool season grasses and legumes can be planted in February. Usually the grass gets planted in September, and then you would plant the legumes in February. That's for cool season. If you're doing warm season and cool season mix, which is getting more plant diversity and all, the warm season should be planted first because it's going to go dormant, and it's easy to get cool seasons enter into the warm season forage. Yeah, so some of those, that's just a list of legumes and grasses that I've had good luck with establishing easy just by throwing seed out there. All right. And there's the seeding dates that I just mentioned. I kind of got ahead of myself, but the grass in the fall, and then the clovers and turnips and all. Well, turnips can be in the fall too. They're better in the fall, but they can be seeded about any time. And you don't want to overdo the legumes. Grazing heights, minimum grazing heights are important when we're managing these after they're established to maintain them. Typically, you don't want to turn in till they're twice or more the height of the minimum grazing height. So, in summary, plant a tree space in an open area that fits your equipment and it's manageable. If you're wanting to mow it, make sure your equipment will fit in there. If you have a 5-foot zero-turn mower, you want at least 7 feet probably between the fence and the tree, or you're gonna, because you got to have some room and flexibility, and the tree's going to grow. But as it grows, it's less important to maintain that area. Maintain that 50 to 60% light to the grass, and yeah, and then you could have as little as 35% shade hitting the ground and grow even better grass. So, and adapt, you're going to have adaptive management. You're going to be removing trees as the more shade develops. You may reseed as needed to get more grass. So you need to be observant, and then, like I say, on the rotation, once a week rotation is really minimal, and watch them rubbing on the tree type thing. Keep them off those trees till they're 15 foot tall or taller. And then place a water system don't just say, well, we've got water to that field and that's good enough, because it's going to limit your management. You're going to have to back graze to water to get it. And just do it and be observant is the bottom line. Some resources that work in trees is a good publication. They put out a lot of different information. National Agroforestry Center, the Center for Agroforestry, and then Temperate Agroforestry Newsletter. Those are all good. I have some stuff on my website, and then this is the one from Scotland, innovativefarmers.org. They have a lot of silvopasture type information. You have to work through, the species are not the same as here, but some of them are. And here it is, that tree selection guide for mid-Atlantic silvopastures. That's a great publication. And I have a pasture walk every October. It's the third Thursday in October, and this time it'll be October 16th. And y'all encouraged to come out. So we'll stop there if that's all right, Marissa. Okay. Yeah, and Brett, jump in here and help me out on any of them. Yeah.
So you was talking about the walnuts, the black walnuts, and the black locusts. You know, they filter light
Right.
more. So could you increase those numbers?
You could, yeah. You could go, again, it's about the amount of light that hit the ground.
And you were talking about, trying to get two uses of land. So if you were like looking at the black locusts, like fence posts,
Right.
would you plant in other words, plant a high population row? What would that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think that could work for sure. And then some people will put a tree, then a shrub, like hazelnut, chestnut.
But am I right, if you plant them close together, wouldn't they be straighter?
They'd be straighter, and then some people plant pines on the outside to keep them from having limbs, as many limbs. Yeah, there's limited rules. These are just kind of the basics, and you go ahead and you could plant them 4 foot apart, and just realize, especially if you're going to harvest when they're 6 inch or 5 inch. One warning though on black locusts is they've got some kind of heart rot now, and if you cut it and that center, the heartwood is dead, don't use it as a fence post. Cedar trees, people think they're great. They're not that wonderful of a fence post. You need at least 50% heartwood on a cedar tree, and I'd want it to be an 8 inch because we're going to end up with 4 inch. So I don't encourage. What? Oh. Yeah, and I'll cheat a little and I'll just strip the side the staples are going to go on, and what goes in the ground. The other, I'll just let it rot off. Yeah, but locust, you don't have to do that too. But watch that heartwood. I got burnt on that.
Yeah. Black locust, if I forget to say this later on, it's my favorite tree for planting for anything agroforestry. And unfortunately, even though I think everybody outside of our state forestry agency sees black locust as a native in New York, it's made its way onto our bad plant list, which I think is a real shame, and creates, even though it doesn't mean you can't plant it or grow it or anything, it just creates that stigma, and you can never talk about black locusts north of the Pennsylvania border without somebody raising their hand saying, "Oh, isn't it an invasive plant?" And it doesn't meet the definition in any way, shape, or form of an invasive plant, but it's an awesome tree, and we use it a lot for fence posts, meaning me and, here's a Yankee coming down telling you about black locusts, but our Mennonite fence contractor told me once upon a time, to Greg's point, that if you're going to use locust posts, your firewood pile better be bigger than your fence post pile. And I think he nailed it there, because you got to be a little bit selective, or you will have a percentage of your posts failing 10 years down the road. We have locust posts on our farm that the neighbor remembers putting in 50 years ago, and they're still holding barbed wire up perfectly fine. Not every single post is still solid and standing, but it's a remarkable tree for its durability plus its ability to just grow fast. And in forestry, there's a term we use called a nurse tree. So I think it's a great example of a nurse tree where you can do those creative mixes to get the locust as kind of your short-term crop that you might be harvesting in 12 to 15 years for posts, and then creating more growing space for the trees that are going to be there for the longer term. Yeah, and I'll show you pictures. That one picture that this troublemaker here pointed out, that's a black locust, black walnut plantation on our farm, and you could see the fence post pile there where we have been thinning out the locust. But I think locust also as a tree is just really compatible with a lot of other trees, and it.
Routes back.
Yeah.
I mean, some people look at that as a negative, but it's a regenerating.
Yeah, and thus, unfortunately, again, it got kind of a black eye as an so-called invasive because it has the habit of creeping into utility right-of-ways and encroaching into road right-of-ways. In New York's case, it encroaches into our pine barren regions, and there's a butterfly biologist that didn't like black locusts creeping into our pine barrens and lobbied to get it on the bad plant list. But
thornless honey locusts, and they produce 200 to 300 pounds of seed per tree. Now, they're a denser canopy, but you can still grow grass under them. But they get, if you're supposed to do a head cut on them, you cut them about this height, and they'll get like 40-foot diameter. But you figure that, let's just say 200 pounds per tree, 10 trees, there's another ton of production per acre. However, there is the threat of them crossing with the thorn type, and then the progeny be thorn type. So supposedly the sheep would crunch that seed and it wouldn't germinate, but some are going to get through. So it's something, just be your own awareness of what's going on, and I wouldn't plant the whole farm in them, but a few. That's right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Right. Exactly. I understand totally, because we've got some thorn trees too, and we also have some flats. So, any other questions? Yeah. I wouldn't. I would just plant near that stump and go again. But Brett, what's your experience with that? Now, evergreens, they'll rot out within 2 years, like pines, and cedar somewhat quick. And a cedar tree won't sprout back unless you leave a green limb on it. Now, you got thoughts on that replant?
When we're starting from scratch and we're adding trees into pasture systems, we're almost always going to want to plant quite a few trees initially and then thin them out over time. So it's conceivable that you could reach that point where you need to clear cut and start over. And in the case of locusts, I would say that black locusts, the trees, honey locust too. Honey locust, by the way, is like the #1 invasive tree in our in Argentina where our other ranch is. So yeah, you're not going to talk anybody into planting honey locust there. It is an amazing mass tree though. Yeah. But in the case of black locust, it's kind of like a plant once, and then you can just regenerate it from the suckering and the stump sprouting, known as coppice. And you're going to plant initially maybe hundreds of trees per acre, and then thin it down to perhaps less than 100 trees, 20, 30 years down the road. And you all get that concept because you're all farmers and organic farmers, which in my mind are way up here in terms of using their eyeballs and their skill. One quick comment on tree planting, because I'm not going to talk about it a lot in part 2, is I've spent 40 years trying to come up with the ideal design for silvopasture plantings, and there's no such thing. I mean, there's like just countless options out there, and I guess today I look at it as thinking, okay, what's my objective here? What's the vision I have for this a few decades down the road, and then work backwards to what your starting point is. And being a forester, I think I have a bit of an advantage in that, because foresters get excited when something happens in like 50 years, and farmers want it to happen in 5 months. And we're talking agroforestry today, which is this big gray area in the middle. So I think we all have to recalibrate our expectations a little bit. You got to think beyond just the first few years, and likewise, as an extension forester, I can't sell people on something they have to wait 50 years for. Good news is I think we can plant trees and get benefits in the very short term out of it, but it's going to require a little bit of foresight there to see, all right, what do I have to do? One other thing. So if you took nothing away from the tree planting discussion so far, understand we have to protect young trees. And I think that's the major disadvantage for when we're starting from the adding trees into pasture versus subtracting trees that already exist. And it's we have to protect them first and foremost from the wildlife. Newly planted trees are a magnet for wildlife. They're usually chock full of nutrients from the forest nursery bed, and it's just something new and novel. So the deer are going to be drawn to them, the bunny rabbits, the rodents. Tree protection, when you start penciling, so the cost of planting the tree is relatively small compared to the cost of keeping that tree alive through the establishment phase. And when you take the cost of things like tubes and deep mulching it and maintaining the vegetation around that, and you pencil that out, the return on investment, so to speak, starts looking really negative really fast. So we have to think of robust and effective ways, but also cost-effective ways to protect trees. And I think that factors heavily into the design, and Greg's caveats about the vegetation management too, because you're going out there and putting these little trees into this, nice kind of like fresh starting condition thing, and then you turn your back for a growing season and everything's engulfed in, and you got a lot more vine issues up down here than we do up in the frozen north. But vegetation's just, competing vegetation is a big challenge of getting young trees, especially hardwoods. There's a reason why tree planting efforts historically have always focused on softwoods. They're trees that you can stick pines out there, and up north it was more like spruce, fir, larch, and walk away from it, and you're going to have trees there somewhere down the road. Doing that with hardwoods, you might as well just dug the hole and stuck your money down in it and covered it up. So.
A few other things. I always put some yellow poplar in the mix. Yeah, we're going to take a break and just cover one thing, but yellow poplar, I'll throw a few in there just for quick shade. We've moved from red oak, now we're planting white oak, because white oak has less tannins, less problems with oak poisoning possibility with livestock. I work with one farm. We're going to bring in pigs when the acorns drop, and just because he's got a lot of oaks in this one silvopasture area, mature silvopasture, and we'll just keep them there for that season. What else? Yeah, looking at those other willows and whatnot.
Yeah, you were mentioning the honey locust and the black locust, but you haven't mentioned anything of the nutrient value or the root value
Right.
of those trees. Aren't they nitrogen fixing?
They are, but they use their own nitrogen. They're not really contributing a lot until that root dies, right? So they're not, you need to count on legumes, clovers for your forage nitrogen. They're very efficient. So they're using their own nitrogen. Alders produce nitrogen, olives produce nitrogen. And both of those can be grazed too, or browsed, but I guess we'll stop there. Oh, the mic, I don't think, oh, it wasn't working a minute ago. Okay, sorry.
Some of what we're talking about now, we're going to dive a little deeper into that after break. And then if I propose we take a break till 3, and then we'll talk some more, and then we should have ample time at the end to back up and talk about this all collectively. So let's start again at 3.